Hi there, welcome to the Animal Intuitive channel. This is Angela Webb, and tonight we have a special guest. In her book, The Grieving Brain, The Surprising Science of How We Learn from Love and Loss, preeminent neuroscientist Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor shares groundbreaking discoveries about what happens in our brains when we grieve, providing a new paradigm for understanding love, loss, and learning. Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor is an associate professor of psychology and director of the Grief, Loss, and Social Stress Lab at the University of Arizona. She is here with us today, and we're going to be talking about how grief affects us and how to move through grief, whether it be a pet that we've lost or a human, and how we move through that in a more functional way as best as possible, and also what has been learned about grief in animals, and of course, answering your questions. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Dr. O'Connor.
Oh, it's so lovely to be here. And please call me Mary Frances.
Oh, thank you. Okay. So I know you've been in great demand these days. Most of your interviews have been about people grieving people. So I know this is slightly different because we're focused on animal and pet loss here tonight. But first off, maybe if it would just be a way to kind of go into this, just to start by hearing what you have found to be the biggest misconception about grief.
I think that probably the biggest misconception comes from old information. So many of us, if we know anything about grief, it's the 5 stages of grieving that Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross made famous. And those were published in 1969. So if you think about how far science has come since 1969, she was an amazing woman, a psychiatrist at a time when there weren't many female psychiatrists. And she did what all good scientists do initially. She observed, right, and described what people were telling her they were experiencing. And so her descriptions of anger and depression and acceptance are still very accurate, but we no longer think about going through those in a linear set of stages. So we don't think, you have all of anger and then you're done with that and then you move on to a new stage of grieving. Rather, now larger studies, you know, there are many feelings that come with grief, but overall we see yearning decreases across time and acceptance increases across time, but it's not linear, right? So some days you feel better and then the next day you may feel worse. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the process. That's just how it feels. So that's probably the biggest misconception.
Okay, and what would you say the difference is between grief and grieving?
I think it's kind of helpful to make a distinction, even though obviously we use those words interchangeably in everyday language. Um, Grief is that awareness of having lost something so important to us. It's just that natural reaction to loss, to bereavement. And it is that wave of grief, right? It's what happens in the moment, so to speak. And the difference then is that grieving is a process. It's the way that grief changes over time, so that we expect for most people those waves. The important part is you're going to have grief even months and years after the death of someone so important to you, or a pet so important to you, when you become aware of their absence, right? So it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your grieving just because you have a wave of grief, right? You can be grieving completely normally and seeing, that it isn't as hard now as it was a month ago or 2 months ago, and still have, or even a year ago or 2 years ago, and still have a wave of grief. If every so often something happens, I'm digging in the back of my closet, and that's where my old dog bed is, and sometimes you get that smell or
Great
something, and it's
example.
been years, right? And still in that moment I will miss her, and
Right.
that's totally normal.
Okay. And I just want to welcome, hi, Good Night Owl. Thank you for everybody who's here watching. And if you're on the replay, thank you. It's good to see you. Yes, thank you. We're so glad to have Dr. O'Connor here tonight, Mary Frances. So, and if you could maybe just help us understand what the brain looks like during grief, because you've done some really interesting studies. So maybe you could tell us about that, how you even know this, how you've seen what the brain looks like.
Well, when we do neuroimaging studies of grief, we invite people to participate in the research. And when they come into the laboratory, we ask them to bring a photograph of the person who has died. And so then we can scan it into the computer and show it to people on goggles while they're lying in the neuroimaging scanner. So what that means is then when they're reacting to that image, when their brain activity comes online in response to looking at that person they're grieving for, then we can measure where that blood flow is happening in the brain, where that neural activity is happening, so that we get a sense of the different parts of the brain or networks of the brain that are important. And what very few people know is actually there's a very early study, neuroimaging. I published the first neuroimaging study of grief in 2003. And not very long after that, there was actually a neuroimaging study looking at pet loss.
Oh,
and we don't, we see that attachment is very similar. We don't see big differences in the brain when you're talking about grieving the death of a pet versus grieving the death of a person. I think it's really about whether there's a bond there, and we know that people have terrific bonds with their pets.
Okay, that's really interesting. I did not realize that study had taken place. And interesting that you say that, because Goodnight Owl is saying that when she lived in the UK many years ago, she was listening to a psychologist who said that grieving the loss of a pet could last 13 plus years. That's interesting. I wonder where they came up with that number. Yeah, it is a comfort, right? That's the thing. It's comforting to know this is real, right?
Yes, it's very real. It's a physiological and neurobiological reaction, as well as an emotional and mental reaction.
Yeah, and you've also talked about sort of breaking this down. You talk about yearning and bonding. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I think what helps to understand why we have such intense grief is to think about the fact that you can't really talk about grief without first talking about love, right? So the way it works is that when we're bonding with, the person who becomes our spouse, or falling in love with our baby or our puppy, that gets stamped into the brain. So there are physiological changes when that bond is formed in the brain. And because of that, there's all sorts of neurochemical changes, and it, stamps it into your memory. This is my one and only. This is the one to find, or this is what they sound like or smell like. And so we don't really have grief if we don't first have bonding. Right? So that sets us up in the brain, so that then when there is separation from that person or pet, then we see physiological changes that are automatic because the bond already exists, right? So being separated from a loved one, it means things like your cortisol goes up, your stress hormone goes up, your heart rate may go up, or blood pressure. And the reason is that we have formed a sense of we, right, with this other being. And so on separation, it's like part of me is gone. Part of how I function in the world is missing. And that experience includes the feeling of grief.
Mm-hmm. I can't help but, not to compare, but on some level, I often think in some ways it's even more intense with a pet, because they're with you physically more. To me, they're cuddling up against you. You're carrying them. They're on your lap. They might be sleeping right next to you. They're home if you're home generally, versus some people in your family might not be there is home as much. So, I think it is really wonderful to hear that there's crossover, and we can apply this understanding,
Yeah,
especially because
when
it's
we
been downplayed sometimes. I'd
right.
say, yeah.
Absolutely. And I don't really think of them as, it's not like there's some total amount of grief and, pets get this much and people
Yeah.
get, it doesn't quite work that way. But the way I think about it is we know there's a bond there when you prefer to spend time with each other, right? Compared to other people
Right.
or animals. And that when you're apart, you wish you were together again, right?
Yeah.
And there's this deep belief that comes along with bonding that can even be subconscious, but the belief of sort of, I will always be there for you and you will always be there for me. Well, I
Right.
can't think of a better description of a pet, really.
Yeah.
Um, and so we know that losses where there's a lot of overlap, like you were saying, day to day, a lot of our routines involve those pets. And so all of that relearning that the brain has
Right.
to do of sort of, if you've cared for a pet who's older and has been sick, I know the waking up in the night and thinking, oh, should I take him out,
Right.
or at first thing in the morning, or, oh, I got to stop and pick up the medicine for, all of our routines are very built around a pet often. And so the brain has to sort of relearn all of those habits. And that takes time. That's not going to
Mm-hmm.
happen instantaneously. And each time it's going to remind us, oh, they're gone. I'm not doing that now.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of why it feels so intense.
Right. And as Goodnight Owl was saying, we share our home, habits, and so much time with our pets. So the grieving is more intense, in my opinion. Yeah. And we're also responsible in so many ways, feeding them, like you said,
Yeah.
medication. I mean, just there's so many
Yeah.
things that give
That
us meaning.
caregiving,
Mm-hmm.
right? That caregiving is such an important aspect of attachment bonds. And you see this obviously with caring for children or caring for older parents, but clearly you see it for caring for pets as well. That caregiving is, it's an attachment behavior, right? And it is both fulfilling for us.
Mm-hmm.
It's needed by them, and it's part of what keeps us together, right? It's a part of you need something and I give you that, or they sense that we need something and give that comfort, say, to us. And so I think those are such critical aspects of that relationship. And I think the other thing that happens is, in many ways, our relationship with pets are less complicated. And what I mean by that is with human beings, there's often a sense of sort of how much independence do you need and how much do you want to put into this relationship versus how much I want to.
Yeah.
And there's often a lot of discussion, around these
Right.
things. With pets, it's nonverbal, right? It's often much less complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that makes it often easier for us to trust them and to feel deeply comforted by them in a way that for some people is really difficult with other human beings.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That being said, I'm wondering, as I'm a licensed therapist too, and I'm thinking always, how does this apply to the therapeutic setting? Like, how does the
Right.
research help us, maybe as therapists, to do a better job of helping people with pet loss?
I think one of the things is just helping people to feel more normal. That I had been studying grief for a very long time when my very first dog, who I didn't have a dog until I was an adult.
Mm-hmm.
My very first dog was euthanized, and her death, while completely as peaceful as you can imagine, it shook me in a way that I was definitely not expecting.
Mm-hmm.
And so, even as much as I knew about grief at that point, um, it really, really felt like this is unbearable. And so I think one of the things therapeutically is simply, normalizing, yes, that is how it feels, right? It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
mean there's something wrong with you. It doesn't mean that you care for your pet more than you care for people in your life or anything like that. It's just,
Mm-hmm.
it is a very intense experience. And so, I mean, I think there are lots of ways that therapists can be useful, but definitely just psychoeducation, of
Mm-hmm.
how grief works, I
Right.
think is incredibly helpful.
Yeah, and I also wonder, I mean, maybe I'm reaching here, but I have this fantasy that people will get as much grief time as they need for pet loss as they would get for human loss.
Yeah.
And I wonder, do you think that the research will get used to help change policies or anything to help in that arena?
I think that's a great question. I mean, I didn't used to know much about bereavement policies. So, for example, bereavement leave in the workplace, things like that. I'm really only now starting to learn about what some of those policies are and how that works. Um, I think we have a ways to go even with human bereavement.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
Um, and so I don't know what the future holds for thinking about bereavement with pets. But I can tell you that, for example, I in our veterinary school here at the University of Arizona, we have a group of people working specifically on human animal interaction. And one of the particular groups that they're interested in are veterans who have service animals,
Hmm.
um, and often emotional support animals. And we've had some long conversations about what does it mean when that service animal either is retired or dies, and how do we help that
Yeah.
vet to understand what's happening? Well, I think about the idea that if that vet is going to a job, right, then how can we not all see that this relationship is so vital to their functioning? How can we
Hmm.
not see that this might require some time to adapt? And
Right.
that's a maybe an extreme example, but I think it may be less of a leap for people to see, oh, bereavement leave should perhaps be able to include service animals, right? That feels like less of a leap, I think, for
Hmm.
people.
Right.
And then potentially to see how this might work, on a bigger scale.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope so. Because, I kind of joke. I have this wonderful dog, Cheyenne, who I love and adore her. But she came into my life because I was working from home at that point, and not for myself, but well, both. I was kind of
Yeah.
doing my business and working for a company. But every time I turned around, she would be my other dog before her would be there. When she passed away, it was just torture because I would
Yeah.
turn around and she wasn't there. And so every time it would reignite the grief process.
Yeah.
So now I have Cheyenne, who I got 10 days after Misha passed, because,
Yeah.
which it was fine. I thought about it ahead of time and it could be, it
Yeah.
wasn't a replacement, but
I think this is such an interesting thing. I think people debate a lot about whether getting another animal is replacement or not.
yeah.
And I think in some ways, part of what that hinges on is whether you are expecting the relationship with the new animal to be what the relationship with the previous animal was.
Yeah.
And if you are disappointed constantly in the
Right.
in the
Yeah.
pet you have now
Right.
because they are not the pet that you had before,
Yeah, that's a
then that
terrible
feels
thing.
unhealthy to me because it doesn't reflect the current reality. It doesn't reflect the uniqueness of this animal. But I think there are people for whom having an animal in their home is incredibly important, is incredibly uh, uh, soothing. And so it's not so much that I think that getting another animal quickly even is automatically problematic. I think it depends, like you said, on the way that the expectations you have, the way you go about it.
Yeah, you have to be very, very aware, very mindful of throughout that process. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And honest with yourself.
Yeah.
Um, well, I'm wondering too, something we talk about on this show a lot is missing pets. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering what you think about the research and missing pets because you don't have that resolution.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah.
We sometimes
Not
call this
resolution, but knowledge
yeah,
that,
no,
yeah,
this
of really what happened.
absolutely. So when you say missing pets, at first I thought you meant, wishing they were here, but you mean when it's unclear what has happened to
Yeah,
them.
lost or missing.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. We find psychologists call this ambiguous loss. And it's really this sort of incredibly difficult state to be in. And I think this is what makes it so difficult. I think that because of the way attachment works, um, it really evolved to, keep us reuniting with our loved ones, right? It's important to come home to the same place every night and, not just randomly show up in someone else's home. It's important that, this relationship is the special one. This is my
Yes.
one and only that I can trust and will be there. But it's also very important for human beings to be able to explore, right? To go off to work and school and forage and, whatever. And so attachment was a way, I think, that evolved to have these invisible tethers that make us yearn for each other when we're apart, if we're bonded with someone, in order to motivate us to come back together again. And so the brain has a solution for the problem of our loved one not being in our presence. The
Hmm.
solution is go get them, right? Or the solution is make such a fuss that they come and find you. And so that works extremely well when we're alive and uses these powerful neurochemicals, dopamine and opioids, and to motivate us and to reward us for keeping those relationship ties strong. The trouble is that part of that enduring belief is, I said before, I'll always be there for you and you'll always be there for me, whether or not you're present in the room at the moment, right? The sort of enduring, the always part is a deep belief that we hold. The problem with a pet that has gone missing is that there's no way to refute the idea in your mind, I need to be there for them. I need to go find them. Because when we have the death of an animal, the pet is euthanized, or we're there when the pet dies, or even we're there, later with cremains or whatever, we have some other reality to hold on to that says, I still yearn for them, but I understand the reality that that's not true anymore. That can't be anymore, even though that is painful. The trouble is when you don't have any knowledge, any, physical evidence that they're gone, I think that other part of us continues to want to seek them out, to find them, to care for them. And I think that's part of what makes it such an incredibly difficult experience.
Yeah, so difficult. Absolutely. Okay, so we had a question. Is there such a thing as guilty grieving? Constantly wondering if you could have done more to save the life of a beloved pet, even if they were terminally ill. Great question. Yeah.
Oh, it's such a great question. And I think this is such an important area. So, psychologists call this rumination. These are the what if questions, and many of you will recognize the sort of would've, should've, could've thoughts, right? If only I could have gotten them to the vet sooner, or the vet should have known to run another test, or if only the animal could have known, that it was, a poisonous snake and not just a snake.
Mm-hmm.
There are an infinite number of these things that we can run around and around in our head. Maybe I should have done this 2 days sooner. Maybe I waited too long, right? The problem with those thoughts is there are no answers to those thoughts, right? There are no answers to those questions. And so the trouble is that each of those questions ends in, and then my pet would have lived. But the reality is that they didn't live. And so if we are going to live in the present reality, in the present moment, then being stuck in those stories in our heads is just not helpful, right? It's not helping us to live now and to create a meaningful life for ourselves. And so trying to track down every physical detail, every, medical reading and it just doesn't change the reality. And I understand not wanting to spend time in the present moment because it can be very painful. But ultimately, our brain is there to help us learn how to live now. And it's only able to do that if we're spending time in the present moment. In the present moment, we can have grief, but we can also have love in the present moment, and silliness, and humor, and all of those good things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's so much what I like to talk about here is just really connecting in with them and knowing that that connection is never gone. You can sit with that loving connection and have that connection no matter what. I know people are talking about just in the chat, I'm haunted over the cause of my demise, Emma. Oh, I'm sorry. I had an Emma too. Her health concerns were mismanaged and I wanted to know what killed her. Yeah, it's so hard. There's this, you're not alone, Katie Cat. That's all I just want to say, because I know that happens.
You're right. Absolutely. And so it becomes more about not whether you're right or not, right? It isn't about whether it would have worked or it should have been done a different way. It's more of not whether thoughts are right or not, but whether they're helping you. And if they're not helping you to be in the moment now, if they're not helping you to sort of create meaningful activities in your life and reconnect with other animals and other people, then it's important to spend time figuring out, how do I get unstuck from those thoughts? Sometimes a therapist is helpful in these cases, but sometimes it's a matter of even just being able to recognize, I think I'm in the would have, could have, should have thoughts right now. And what can I do to get out of them right now? I know for me, it was, for a long time, it was, I need to change my environment. I need to go for a walk, or I need to see a friend or something, right, to get me out of my head. For some people, it's doing something physical, right? So I need to go for a run, or I need to do yoga or whatever to get me out of my head and sort of more into my body.
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful, important point. And also, I also like to think about, what would your pet want for you now? Would they want you to be, the animals are so pure hearted, and they wouldn't want you to be stuck. They want you to have a wonderful life.
And really, when you think about it, that last experience that you had with the animal, although it may be the one that sticks with you, it's such a tiny proportion of your relationship. And so focusing on the whole relationship rather than just that little tiny piece, can, I think, be useful sometimes.
Very good point. Yep. I don't want to let you go without asking you about voles.
Yes. So voles are these little tiny rodents that live in North America, all over North America. And they are unique and fascinating because they pair bond for life. So once one vole has fallen in love, they don't call it falling in love. Once one vole has pair bonded with another vole, they will prefer to spend time with that vole as compared to any other vole they ever come across. And that pair bond only grows stronger when they have a litter together and the longer they spend together. But what's fascinating is we actually know a lot about how that works in their brain. So we know that there are actually epigenetic changes in the brain that happen when that pair bond forms. So the proteins around the genes, right in a very specific part of the middle of the brain, those proteins are folded differently because these two animals are bonded. Wow. Which is just incredibly fascinating.
Yeah.
And then if those animals are separated, we can see the automatic change in their oxytocin levels and their cortisol levels, or corticosterone it's called in rodents. And so it helps us to understand, I think, many people describe this as feeling like it sort of validates their grief experience, in the sense that obviously we have 2 pounds of additional brain compared to voles. So it's not that our experience is exactly the same as voles, but there's no reason to think that some of those neurobiological processes may not have been conserved across species, right? That we might similarly have these types of reactions. And in some cases from scientific studies, we know we do have these physiological reactions. Somehow seeing the physiology of it, somehow for many people makes it feel real. I don't think it's necessary to see the physiology for it to be real, but for many people, that is how it feels, very validating.
It's so interesting. And wondering about Canada geese. Have you heard this?
So there are quite a number of birds that pair bond for life. So there are a number of different species, obviously, that pair bond. Voles we happen to know a lot about, in part because there are 2 strains of voles. There's prairie voles and mountain voles. And one of the things that is fascinating is prairie voles are what we call socially monogamous. They have this pair bond where they prefer this one vole. Mountain voles, even though they're genetically very similar, they don't actually create pair bonds. They will just mate, with whomever is available. And so part of what neuroscientists were so interested in was, why the difference if they're so similar? And it turns out this is some of the genetics and where various receptors are in parts of the brain and so forth. Now, birds evolved from a slightly different part of the evolutionary tree, but they also, many of them, show very intense pair bonds. Emperor penguins, for example. I don't know if you've ever seen March of the Penguins, but, the papa penguin will sit on that egg for a month in the winter while the mama penguin goes out into the sea and fishes, right? And there's got to be that enduring belief, that really strong attachment. They will be back, right? They will bring food. Yeah. Because if the papa penguin decides, I'm not sure if she's coming back, I'm going to go hunt for food, that egg is not going to survive, right? And so that enduring attachment is so important for our survival. You can see why the brain would have evolved to really make sure that those attachments were strong.
So interesting. And I'm wondering, what do you think the future is of grief study? What's it going to bring us?
I think a lot of things. I think that we're starting to understand that particular kinds of therapy are more helpful for people than other kinds of therapy. I think we're starting to understand individual differences in people who adapt pretty well, pretty typically, and people who don't seem to be adapting. And I think we're learning more about why, but also how to help them kind of get back on a more natural grieving trajectory. So I think there are a lot of really fascinating studies yet to be done to understand.
Are you thinking more in line like midbrain treatments, like brain spotting, and things that address what's going on more, like from a brain change, or working with the brain in that way? Is that what you're seeing more?
So as a neuroscientist, I think it's really helpful to understand the neurobiological systems that make up attachment bonds and respond when we're separated. Even though I think it's important to understand these systems, I don't necessarily think that the best intervention is to mess with the brain physically or even pharmacologically. So if there's a way for me to help a person to attach to a living loved one, to strengthen a bond with a living loved one, and that shows some change in the way their attachment biology works, then it's great to be able to understand, this is why this works this way. This is how to focus for this person, even though the intervention is psychological, right? It's teaching them new skills. It's encouraging them, maybe for a person who doesn't have a lot of support, right? And so I think that it's very helpful to understand these processes. That doesn't necessarily mean that the intervention has to be direct into the brain. Rather, through our behavior and our thoughts and our feelings, our brain naturally changes.
Great, wonderful. So I think it's wonderful because it offers a different way to look at things, and I think it gives hope because, first of all, just being validated, the confirmation of what's going on really helps people, and also just knowing that there's probably a lot more to come. I think I saw you had another book coming out, and please, we mentioned your book in the beginning, but please go ahead and mention the books that you have or would like to talk about before we end.
So I've only written one book, and so far it's called The Grieving Brain. It's behind
there it
me
is.
here.
It's right there.
Yes.
Good.
And I'm writing another book that will be called The Grieving Body. So sort of not just what happens in the brain, but what happens in the body as well when we grieve.
Wonderful.
And this book is the only one available, but this book is available anywhere books are sold, your local independent bookstore, Amazon, anywhere. And it also comes in Kindle and audiobook and so.
Okay, wonderful. So we'll be looking out for all of that, and maybe you'll come back one day when you have the other book written and talk with us more. We love that.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And thank you everybody who's been here and for your questions. And if you're watching the replay, let us know in the comments, what was helpful for you was there something new that you learned today? Because we love to have the conversation. So, all right. Thank you, everybody.
So much. Take care.
Take.